So I do advocacy. I've done it for 30 years for NRDC, and I see some of my colleagues, Henry, if you just wave at everybody from NRDC here. Also, I started out as an attorney for the Hudson River Keeper, and we now have 200 water keepers around the country. The umbrella group is called the Hudson River Keeper. In addition to that, I'm a partner in the biggest green tech venture capital firm and probably the most profitable in the country, which is called Vantage Point. And I believe that innovation is probably the most revolutionary and hopeful tool of advocacy today. But I'm going to talk directly about advocacy and advocacy of water. I'm going to give you a little bit about the history of this movement. It started out, the keeper movement started out on the Hudson River back in 1966, and it was launched by a blue-collar coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen who mobilized to reclaim the river from its polluters. We have on the Hudson the oldest commercial fishery in North America. It's 350 years old. Many of the people I represent come from families that have been fishing the river continuously since Dutch colonial times. It's a traditional gear fishery. They use the same fishing methods that were taught by the Algonquin Indians to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam, and then passed down through the generations. One of the enclaves of the commercial fishery on the river is a little village called Crotonville, New York. That's 30 miles north of New York City on the east bank of the river. The people who lived there in 1966 were not, your prototypical kind of tweed-jacketed, bearded, pipe-smoking, affluent environmentalists. They were factory workers, carpenters, lathers, electricians. Half the people in Crotonville made their living, or at least some part of it, fishing or crabbing the Hudson. These were people who had little expectation that they'd ever see Yosemite or Yellowstone or the national parks. For them, the environment was their backyard. It was the bathing beaches, the swimming holes, the fishing holes, the Hudson River. Richie Garrett, who was the first president of the Riverkeeper, used to say about the Hudson, it's our Riviera, it's our Monte Carlo. Richie Garrett was a grave digger from Austining, New York. And he used to tell his new followers, I'll be the last to let you down. But in 1966, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton-Harmon rail yard. The oil went up the river on the tides, blackened the beaches, made the shad taste of diesel, so they couldn't be sold at the Fulton Fish Market in New York City. And all the people in Crotonville came together in a room about this size, the only public building in the town, the Parker Bale American Legion Hall. There were 300 people there that night, and they stayed there till 2 o'clock in the morning. And this was a very patriotic community. Crotonville had the highest mortality rate during World War II of any community in the United States. Virtually the entire male population joined the Marines the day after Pearl Harbor. Almost all the original officers, founders, and members of Riverkeeper were former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II in Korea. These weren't radicals, they weren't militants, they were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country. But that night they started talking about violence because they saw something that they thought they owned, which was the abundance of these fisheries and the purity of the Hudson's waters, things that their parents and grandparents had exploited for generations, and it was being robbed from them by large corporate entities over whom they had no control. And they had been to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution, to the Corps of Engineers, the Conservation Department, and the Coast Guard, and they were given the bum's rush. They made Richie Garrett, who was a Korean War vet, made 20 separate visits with another Marine named Art Glauca to the Corps of Engineers office in Manhattan, begging the Corps Colonel to do his job and shut down the Penn Central pipe. And he finally told them in exasperation, these are important people. Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, we can't treat them that way. In other words, we can't force them to comply with the law. And by this evening of March of 1966, virtually everybody in Crotonville had come to the conclusion that government was in cahoots with the polluters. And the only way that they were going to reclaim the river for themselves is to confront the polluters directly. And somebody suggested that they put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central pipe and burn up the pipe. Somebody else said they should roll a mattress up and jam it up the pipe. and flood the rail yard with its own waste. Somebody else said that they should float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant, which at that time was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables. Then a guy stood up, another Korean War vet, Marine, named Bob Boyle, and he was the outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated magazine. He still is today. He's been there for 70 years. And he was a great fly fisherman and spin fisherman. He'd written half a dozen books on angling. 2 years before, he had written a book, an article for Sports Illustrated about angling in the Hudson. And in researching that article, he had come across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. That statute said it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States. You had to pay a big penalty if you got caught. But also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And he called the libel lawyers at Time Inc., which owned Sports Illustrated, and he said, "Is this still good law?" They sent him a memo back saying in 80 years it's never been enforced, but it's still on the books. And that evening, when all these men and women were talking about violence, he stood up in front of them with the copy of that law and the memo from the attorneys, and he said, "We shouldn't be talking about breaking the law. We should be talking about enforcing it." And they resolved that evening that they were going to start a group. It was then called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association. It later became Riverkeeper. They were going to go out, track down, and prosecute every polluter on the Hudson. 18 months later, they collected the first bounty in United States history under this 19th century statute. They shut down the Penn Central Pipe for good. They got to keep $2,000, a huge amount of money in 1968 in Crotonville, New York. There were 2 weeks of wild celebration in the town, and they used the money that was left over to go after Ciba Geigy, Tuck Tape, Standard Brands, American Cyanamid, the biggest corporations in America, and they won their cases. In 1973, they collected the biggest penalty in United States history against a corporate polluter. They got $200,000 from Anaconda Wire and Cable for dumping toxics at Hastings, New York. They used the money to construct a boat, which they called the Riverkeeper, which today plies the river, tracking down polluters. They used bounty money in 1973 or 1983 to hire their first full-time Riverkeeper, a former commercial fisherman named John Cronin. He hired me using bounty money a year later as the first prosecuting attorney for the group. Then I started a litigation clinic at Pace Law School, where I have 10 students who practice law under my supervision. And we give them each 4 polluters to sue at the beginning of the semester, and they file cases, they do discovery, depositions, they go to court. If they don't win the case, they don't pass the course. And we actually have a group here from the University of Chicago that has started a clinic right here in Chicago, and we're going to try to do the same thing with the Chicago River and Lake Michigan. So let's give them a hand. And will you guys stand up for a second? So since we started this clinic, we brought over 400 successful lawsuits against Hudson River polluters. We forced polluters on the river to spend over $4.5 billion remediating the river. Today, as a result of our work, the Hudson River, which was a national joke in 1966, is an international model for ecosystem protection. This is it produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator. It's the last major river system left on both sides of the Atlantic, and I'll throw in the Mediterranean, the Baltic, the Aegean, the Adriatic, the Marmara, the Dardanelles, the Bosphorus, all the rivers that pour into those waterways. There's only one left that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish. It's Noah's Ark, it's a species warehouse. It's the last refuge for many of these animals that are going extinct elsewhere. And the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson has inspired the creation of water keepers now all across North America. We have 200 licensed. We own the keeper name. We have them on virtually all of the major West Coast rivers, from Prince William Sound, the Cook Inlet in Alaska, the Fraser River in Canada, the Tualatin in the Columbia, the Willamette, Puget Sound, San Francisco Bay, Santa Monica Bay, all the way down to Laguna San Ignacio on the Baja Peninsula. We have 29 river keepers in Mexico, mainly local fishing groups. Each one has to have a patrol boat. They have to have a full-time keeper, and they have to be willing to fight polluters, usually through litigation. We are a law enforcement organization. We have them on all the East Coast rivers, from the Bay of Fundy to Biscayne Bay in Miami, Bay of Fundy in Canada, on virtually all the major rivers. There's a couple of unifying themes that keep this movement together. One is this idea that we own the waterways. We, the people, own the waterway. They're not owned by the state. They're not owned by the big polluters, the hog industry, the oil companies, the fracking companies. They're owned by the people. The Constitution of the state of Illinois says the people of this state own the waterways of the state. Every child in Cook County, whether black or white, young or old, humble or noble, rich or poor, has an absolute right to go down to the Chicago River, Lake Michigan, bring out a whitefish, throw in a plug, bring out a whitefish or a sturgeon, lake sturgeon, and bring it home and feed it to their family with the security they're not going to poison somebody. But that right has been stolen from the people of this state. This is, by the way, an ancient right. It goes back to it's in the Constitution of every state. It goes back to the Code of Justinian 2,000 years ago, which was the first attempt at constitutional government. And the Code of Justinian said that all of those things that are by their nature the part of the commons, the Commonwealth, the air, the water, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, the beaches, the aquifers, it enumerates these in the Code of Justinian, that they belong to the people. If you have whether you're European, if you were a citizen of Rome, you had an absolute right to cross the beach, throw in a net, and pull out your share of the fish. The emperor himself couldn't stop you. The first, among always the first acts of a tyranny, are efforts by powerful private entities to privatize the public trust, to privatize the commons and turn them into private profit. During the Dark Ages, when Roman law broke down in Europe, in every jurisdiction in Europe, the local kings and feudal lords began privatizing the public trust assets that were kept in the commons by the Roman law. For example, in England, King John said that the deer, and all the other game animals, which were a big social safety net for the poor, if you lost your job or you ran out of money, you could go shoot a deer. He said, you can't do that anymore. They belong to the nobility. Only me and my friends can hunt them. He also erected navigational tolls on the Thames so that what was once free and an important economic boom for the poor to go up and down the river without paying for it, now you had to pay for it. He also sold monopolies on the fisheries of England to wealthy people and to his friends. And this was the final social safety net. And as a result of that, the public rose up, triggered by this anger, led by the barons, confronted him at the Battle of Runnymede and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which was the beginning of constitutional democracy on our planet. The Magna Carta is the Bethlehem of all of our Bill of Rights in the United States Constitution, even ones we don't have anymore, like habeas corpus. But in addition to the principal Bill of Rights, there's also chapters on free access to fisheries, to navigable waters, and to all of the other public trust assets. And, sometimes I'll go be across a negotiating table from a polluter, and he'll say, well, we need some more time to get all the crap that we put in that wetland out of the wetland. And you can't blame us because these laws, were made up by a bunch of hippies after Earth Day, and how are we to see it coming? But it's always been illegal to pollute the environment. It's always been illegal to pollute the public trust. And in fact, in the 16th century, there was a law, a Clean Air Act in London that made it illegal to burn coal in stoves in London, and it was a capital crime, and people were executed for the offense. So it's always been illegal. Now, the other thing I would say is this. The other kind of unifying thought is that we're not protecting nature so much for the sake of the fishes and the birds. We're protecting it for our own sake because we recognize that nature is the infrastructure of our communities. And that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a nation, as a civilization, which is to create communities for our children that provide them with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health as the communities that our parents gave us, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, those assets that cannot be reduced to private property ownership, but by their nature are part of the commons. They're part of the whole community. They have to be regulated by government because the tragedy of the commons, which is an economic law, says that they're not regulated. Each of us in our own self-interest will catch the last fish in the ocean and destroy the resources of the community. So those need regulation. I'm a strong believer in free market capitalism. And as were the fishermen that I represented, who are all small businessmen. And they understood this. You know, you hear this mantra on Capitol Hill from the big polluters and their indentured servants in our political process, which says that we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. That is a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, over the long term, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the polluters and their toadies want us to do, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can do that and generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy. We can make a few people rich by impoverishing the rest of us, but our children are going to pay for our joyride, and they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and poor health and huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time and that they'll never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the costs of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. And one of the things that I've done as an environmental advocate over the past 3 decades is to constantly go around and confront this argument that an investment in our environment is a diminishment of our nation's wealth. It doesn't diminish our wealth. It's an investment in infrastructure. The same as investing in telecommunications or road construction. It's an investment we have to make if we're going to ensure the economic vitality of our generation and of future generations. I want to make one last point, and that's this. For 30 years, people ask me what's the most important thing we can do, the most important law we can pass. And this will go over well here in Chicago, which is the home of right-wing capitalism. I've always said the same thing, to have a true free market capitalism, which we don't have in this country, by the way, and which Milton Friedman is not an advocate of. In a true free market promotes efficiency, and efficiency means the elimination of waste. And pollution is waste. And a true free market would encourage us to properly value our natural resources. And it's the undervaluation of those resources that cause us to use them wastefully. But in a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. But what polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else. And they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, I will show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. That's what all pollution is, no matter where you look at it. It's always somebody cheating, not only subverting democracy, but cheating the free market capitalism. And if you're a polluter in this country, like the Koch brothers, which are two of the biggest polluters, and the biggest privately owned company, oil company in the world, and you've got an extra $300 million at the end of the year surplus, your best use of that money is not to invest it in exploration or drilling or retooling your plants or retraining your workers, but in giving it to a political candidate who's going to return that money to you in spades by waiving pollution law and allowing you to privatize the commons. So we have a campaign finance system that is just a system of legalized bribery, which encourages people to capture these, our politicians and help them dismantle the marketplace, give them monopoly control, and allow them to privatize the commons. And all of the environmental laws that we've talked about, the other speakers have talked about today, they're all passed after Earth Day 1970, 28 major environmental laws. NRDC wrote almost all of them, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, Endangered Species Act. All of those laws were intended to restore free market capitalism in our country by forcing actors in the marketplace to pay the true costs of bringing their product to market. And what we have to understand in this country is that there's a huge difference, and what they need to understand, but what Milton Friedman and his cronies need to understand, and his disciples, is there's a huge difference between free market capitalism, which makes a nation more efficient, more prosperous, and more democratic, and the kind of corporate crony capitalism that we've now embraced in our country, which is as antithetical to efficiency, prosperity, and democracy in America as it is in Nigeria. The free market is the most powerful economic engine ever devised, but it has to be harnessed to a social purpose, or it will pull us down the slippery road to oligarchy, to pollution, to destruction of our democracy. Wherever you see, like, the best measure of how democracy functions is how it distributes the goods of the land. Does it keep the air, the water, the wildlife in the hands of all the people, or does it allow them to be stolen and concentrated in the hands of a few? I have 3 sons who have asthma. The principal cause of asthma attacks in this country today is ozone and particulates from 600 coal-burning power plants who are discharging it illegally because the Bush administration gave them a buy to do that. And I can watch my children gasping for air on bad air days because somebody gave money to a politician. And those somebodies are those utilities and those coal companies that literally have stolen the air from my children's lungs. The fish in the Hudson, though they're abundant, can no longer be eaten. The commercial fisheries are closed because the General Electric Company contaminated them with PCBs. The coal companies contaminated them with mercury and privatized the fish in the Hudson. So the same thing that caused the public to rise up and confront King John, back when they wrote the Magna Carta, the same things are happening in this country today. The privatization of the commons. And this is, we have to understand that democracy, ultimately, anytime you see environmental destruction, you'll also see the subversion of democracy. You'll see the destruction of zoning and planning laws and sovereignty at the local level, which is the key to democracy. You'll see the capture of the agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution. They become the sock puppets for the big polluters they serve, and you'll see the corruption of public officials who are bought and sold by these big polluting companies who can expand their profits by getting rid of the laws that are designed to protect other Americans. And that ultimately, when we are fighting for the environment, we're fighting for something that's even much bigger, which is our democracy. Thank you very much.